Okay. On the contrary, I realized that even though I started writing novels at the age of 48, I was always narrating.
So the DSM-5 lays out the following 2 criteria for autism spectrum disorder. First, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. And second, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. Furthermore, symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, and symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. The DSM also makes clear that disturbances characteristic of ASD could also be caused by an intellectual disability, or that ASD and ID can be co-present in an individual who represents these disturbances. With that said, what is autism beyond that? When a child is diagnosed, what does that mean? What does that diagnosis of autism point to for that child, or for their parents? What does it point to for the neurotypical individuals who comprise the society around them? And how does a communal discourse interpret a condition that affects millions globally? For an answer, we're going to have to turn away from psychiatric medicine and seek out the roots of interpretation and what we might consider to be truth. So Umberto Eco is an Italian thinker born in 1932. He was prolific in his writings during the mid to late 20th century, and if you've spent any time on any left-leaning side of the internet, you'll undoubtedly recognize him from his 1995 essay, Fascism. It's often used as a means of analyzing modern American politics in really way too many video essays. And so among that essay and his novels and nonfiction work, Eco wrote substantially on the topic of semiotics, discussing the creation of signs, what they mean, and how they're interpreted. And then in 1994, he collects 14 of these essays on the topic, alongside one short story, and publishes them together as The Limits of Interpretation. In the book, Eco discusses interpretation writ large, semiotic drift, the interpretation of falsehoods, and several other topics treating the issues of interpretation as primarily psychosocial phenomena. From this discussion, I'd like to quickly pull 3 ideas to help us address the initial question, what is autism? Specifically, I want to talk about furnished worlds, serialization, and then forgeries and lies. Each of these will hopefully give us the tools to assess autism not just as a list of criteria presented in the DSM, but as a phenomenon that's as constructed as it is experienced. So imagine for a moment a conversation between 2 friends. Let's call them Tom and John. The latter owns a 5-meter long boat in this instance. Tom believes John's boat to be 10 meters long and is hoping to buy a boat of similar size. So together they go to the lake and they see John's boat. Upon seeing it, he notices the size and the following interaction takes place. Tom goes, "I believe that your boat was bigger than that." And John says, "No, my boat is not bigger than that." And this is how Eco sets up the first interpretive tool we'll use, that of the furnished world. A furnished world is an interpretive mechanism used by our minds in order to more quickly access the realm of possibilities in any given instance. In this instance, 2 furnished worlds come into play alongside the real world. Tom employs an understanding of a world furnished by John's 10-meter long boat, and John one in which he owns a 5-meter long boat. These worlds are created and informed by the prior material that any given mind has taken in. The possible furnishings of any small world can only come from instances previously interpreted to be true, even if it's not confirmed, thus informing the swath of possible future truths. The contents of a furnished world tell us 2 things about interpretation. They indicate that whatever is discussed both comes from a prior instance of a truthful possible interpretation, and that as such, it can reasonably be understood to be possible in the future. In the case of John and Tom and the boat, the various components of these furnished worlds imply experiences these 2 people have had with boats of varying sizes, in so much as a 5-meter boat and a 10-meter boat can both reasonably exist. Now, obviously, analyzing discourse and coming to the conclusion that moderately sized boats exist is not revolutionary on its own, but it is illustrative of a furnished world as indicative of past interpretation and its impact on future analysis of input. Those mechanics of possible implication come more to the fore under repetition, a phenomenon Eco takes care to address in the later chapter, Interpreting Serials. The focus on serialization and repetition relies on an understanding that repetition reinforces the validity of an instance, and it gives it more instances to be drawn upon and then placed into a furnished world. Eco presents the following analysis into the context of mass media. Let us now consider the universe of mass media and see the case in which 1. Something is offered as original and different, according to the requirements of modern aesthetics. 2. We are aware that this something is repeated something that we already know. And 3. Notwithstanding this, better just because of it actually, we like it and we buy it. It's this repetition of common items, of themes and motifs that make them more solid, more readily accepted into discourse, even more possible for placement and acceptance into a furnished world. And it's just this strengthening that leads us to the creation and interpretation of. So forgery, or more useful for our purposes, a lie, is a pivotal mechanism for Echo, for helping us to understand how far interpretation can go. Lies, for Echo, represent the combination of both furnished worlds and serialization. He suggests that belief in a forgery or a lie is predicated on its resemblance to some other real object. A lie has to resemble an already established truth in order to be believed. As he says, the sufficient condition for a forgery is that it be claimed by some claimant that the lie is indiscernibly identical to the truth. Following our prior two interpretive mechanisms, we can see how lies creep into believable discourse. They resemble the occupants of previously accepted furnished worlds, and, in the strongest lies, one that has been strengthened through serialization. This foundation of prior recognition can even be so strong that a lie can be believed only through resemblance to some amorphous truth we are accustomed to, even when no external proofs are available. For Echo, concepts of truth and falsity, authentic and fake, identity and difference circularly define each other. We can interpret a lie as truth through its resemblance, and at that point it becomes accepted truth, and can then be used as a credible component of a future furnished world. This is how lies can possibly direct discourse that shapes the collective understanding on which they then operate. Now, with all that said, I still haven't answered, what does all this have to do with autism spectrum disorder? And how does an understanding of interpretation explain to us what it is, if not the criteria listed in the DSM? Well, I'd like to suggest something that's going to take a bit to explain. Autism, as a word, as an idea, extends far beyond the criteria the DSM-5 lays out. Autism spectrum disorder is a network of social connections, a lived experience of certain individuals that, in conjunction with a network of outside voices, informs the discourse that creates the realm of possible interpretations around it, a discourse that then circles back to influence the lived experiences of those with ASD. So what do I mean by that? People with ASD obviously don't live in a vacuum. They live in a society with other individuals, and interactions with neurotypical individuals that deal with autism would obviously have an impact on their lives in the day-to-day and in the long term. Conversations, questions, all interactions impact everyone in this way when they pertain to an aspect of your life. And as we've established, these interactions would involve the use of furnished worlds by both parties, and that those furnished worlds are vulnerable to prior interactions, regardless of external validity. So, if we were seeking out a comprehensive understanding of what autism is as a social experience, and say there was like a prevalent mistruth about autism, like,
much of the fear surrounding vaccines stems from their supposed link to autism.
One that was backed up by some sort of foundational medical study.
Disgraced and discredited the doctor who convinced thousands of parents to skip vital vaccinations for their children.
And politicians said things like
that these vaccinations pose danger. For example, when Senator Lambert and I were growing up, autism did not exist.
My grandson got 9 shots in one day, 7 of which had mercury in it, and he became autistic.
The rise in autism is a result of the preservatives that are in our vaccine.
And even the President of the United States said stuff like this.
Autism has become an epidemic. 25 years ago, 35 years ago, you look at the statistics, not even close. I am totally in favor of vaccines, but I want smaller doses.
We might start to see Echo's interpretive tools at play. We see lies and forgeries of genuine scientific research, given preliminary validity in their resemblance to established scientific studies, then serialized in a sense by public figures and politicians, then going on out to inform the realm of possibilities when discussing autism in subsequent discourse. Autism starts to become what people say it is, seemingly divorced from its clinical criteria. Public discourse around autism becomes less about people with ASD and more focused on peddling theories and lies that take on the themes of serialized motifs of verified science in order to gain traction, becoming accurate forgeries in the eyes of certain individuals and groups, further informing the realm of possible furnishings for interpretive worlds. which leads to connecting autism to vaccines, which makes no sense because there's no evidence and there's so much
culture, you just think that.
But that's not the point. The absurdity of the lies on their own is not the point. The final chapter of Echo's The Limits of Interpretation is titled On Truth, a Fiction. It's a short story in which human astronauts are interfacing with an alien artificial intelligence, asking it questions in order to ascertain whether or not the AI's creators have the mental capacity to interpret. The story serves as an allegory by which Echo can create a conversation with himself, going back and forth, trying to create his own epistemology of sorts, figuring out how interpretation plays into the ideas of truth and what truth is in that lens. The final sentiment issued by the AI seems to be Echo's answer to such a question. When asked what any given thing would mean, or how it would be interpreted, the AI responds with a message given to it by its creator. You can mean nothing which we have not taught you, and then only so far as you address some word as the interpretation of your thought. That is to say, man and the external signs are identical, in the same sense in which the words homo and man are identical. Thus, my language is the sum total of myself. Autism is not solely the criteria laid out in the DSM-5, and the ways in which autism is talked about are not only important, but a crucial aspect in defining what autism is. Autism is an experience lived by millions of individuals globally. It is an experience interpreted by the language of public discourse surrounding it. When a politician gets on stage and suggests that vaccines cause autism and should therefore be stopped, that implies an understanding that ASD is negative, something to be avoided. Discourse like that impacts the language of autism, it furnishes our worlds of interpretation, and it informs the lived experiences of those with ASD. As much as autism is a medical condition, one that can be pathologized in clinics and studied for treatment, autism is at the same time a social phenomenon, one that is shaped by the culture in which it resides. In order to know what autism is beyond a diagnosis, you have to take into consideration the limits of its interpretation, how far they extend, and how those interpretations shape the experience of those with ASD. The language surrounding autism is the sum total of autism, and autism is the sum total of the language with which we talk about it.